Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, October 14th, 2020, and I've got another one of those "they don't teach you this in government schools" episodes. Today in history, on October 14th, 1774, the First Continental Congress adopted a Declaration of Rights that included a number of things that can be found in the foundation and structure of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It also set the foundation or reaffirmed the foundation for resistance and nullification as we know it today. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the history behind this and some of the most important principles it contains. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can find everything you need to follow this show. All the archives on individual episodes. I include a bunch of reference links to original source material so you can read and learn more of what I'm really just scratching the surface on. You can find all the platforms we're on, both video and then audio-only podcasts like iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, iHeart, TuneIn, and Amazon Music and the rest. And you can also find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. All that and more over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We've got a bunch of different categorized episodes as you scroll down that page. We'll be adding to that and improving it over time. So if you've got some suggestions, I always want to hear from you. Your ideas help out a great deal. A quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we're allowing everyone time to get their notifications for the live stream. Over on YouTube, Essential Freedom, Funky Euphemism, Bob Landry, Patricia Dance, Brody Scarlick, Clay Kent over on Facebook, MRGF78, Rob Wood, always good to see you, buddy. Dan Reed, same to you. Erwin Haverneck, hooray for 1774, that's pretty cool. Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty, down in Austin, Texas. Virginia Beach, Filthy Capitalist. I love some of these screen names, and thank you guys, Ivan and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anyone. Whatever platform you happen to be on, whether you're live or in the archive, I'm so grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you for being here. Let's get right to this. I want to start with just a little background. I've got a link here from the Khan Academy that actually has a pretty good overview, and I will include this along with everything else in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I had a great suggestion in the comments recently from Andrew Green. I should go back and re-edit at least on YouTube, the description and include the link to the show notes for that individual episode. I'm going to try to figure out how to get that all worked in. Thank you, Andrew, and everyone else for your suggestions. Anyways, let's get right to this. From Khan Academy, this is an interesting summary. They put it this way. After the Boston Tea Party, the British adopted a divide and conquer strategy that sought to isolate troublemaking Boston from the other colonies, which leaders in Parliament believed were merely tagging along with Boston's radicals. So their goal was to pass a bunch of laws, bunch of bills, and then make Boston isolated so their activism would crumble because they'd be so aggressive about it. Enforce the law, right? So in the spring of 1774, Parliament passed what they called the Coercive Acts. What a great name. At least they're honest about it. They weren't coming up with names like Patriot or anything. They wanted people to know, we are coercing you. They were aimed solely at Boston and envisioned as punishment for its radical opposition to British policies. The Coercive Acts, which quickly became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, another great name because they're saying, like, look, we cannot tolerate this. This is the mindset of people who believe in freedom, as Thomas Jefferson also put it in 1774. He said specifically, look, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature, I'm paraphrasing, and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. This is the type of attitude that they had for liberty. If they try to force you to do something, if they try to mandate something on you, you consider it intolerable and you refuse to assent to it. You refuse obedience to it. Today, we have it the other way around, and everybody wants to go to a federal court in the hopes that the federal court will grant them permission to be free or tell the federal government to stop doing what the federal government's been doing all along. We're talking about a nation of wimps, unfortunately. Not that I'm some tough guy or anything, but collectively, for lack of a better term, there's got to be some different approach. And hopefully this history will give us some insight. So they passed these 4 separate legislative measures. I'll go through them just briefly. There's the Boston Port Bill. This fined Boston for the tea destroyed in the Boston Tea Party and closed the harbor until the fines were paid. Shut down trade. The government bill rewrote the Massachusetts colony's charter, granting broadly expanded powers to the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act authorized the governor to send indicted government officials to other colonies or to London for trial. They were going to go and arrest the local government officials. The Quartering Act, which applied to all of the North American colonies, was designed to provide shelter for British troops, allowing them to be housed in private buildings. And that, of course, led into the Third Amendment as we know it today. Now, they wanted to isolate Boston, but far from isolating Boston, the new laws actually cast the city and the activists, the patriots there, as martyrs, and it rallied, it sparked new support and resistance throughout all of the colonies. And here from Monticello.org, they have a nice page on this, the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, which is what we're covering today. And they put it this way: in response to Parliament's passage of the Coercive Acts, 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia did not send a representative, sent delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia to plan a strategy of united resistance against Britain. They first met in September of that year. The attendees, this is from constitutioncenter.org, the attendees didn't include Benjamin Franklin, who had written a letter about this anonymously and published it in the press in England, or Thomas Jefferson, but John Adams was there, and John Adams really was railing for independence. He didn't just want resistance. He actually got the nickname, not only as being the hothead, but he really got the nickname there as being the Atlas of Independence. So John Adams was kind of really fiery and outspoken in support of separation and secession, but the delegates also included Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, John Jay, John Dickinson, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington. A lot of the big names that we're familiar with today, they were there organizing and planning in September and October of 1774 on what to do with these intolerable or coercive acts. Again, from Constitution Center, the delegates gathered on the morning of September 5th at Philadelphia's City Tavern. I love that they just met in a bar near Benjamin Franklin's home before they went to Carpenter's Hall, which had just been constructed. Thomas Jefferson's cousin Peyton Randolph was named as the first president of the Continental Congress. He was another prominent Virginia leader and a close friend of George Washington. During their session in Philadelphia, again from constitutioncenter.org, which ended after about 7 weeks of debate, so it started on September 5th and ended around October 20-ish, the group agreed to boycott British goods within the colonies as a sign of protest, spelled out in the Articles of Association. Now, I'm going to actually go through some of the things that were passed. The actual boycott document wasn't passed until later. I think it was on the 20th or 22nd. But they had an order. Basically, they said, here's what we're going to do in this set of resolutions, what we're going to do next. And then they followed up on this. Now, going to this a little bit further, it outlined, and this is from Wikipedia, which has a pretty good overview. Now, it's called the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, but it actually goes by a number of other names, and I was chatting with Funky Euphemism in the YouTube chat before the show started, and it can cause some confusion about what they call it. Was it the Declaration of Rights? So that could easily be confused with the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and thanks for the suggestion. I think I'll probably do an episode on that next year when the date comes up for that as well. Or it's also called the Declaration of Colonial Rights, and this was adopted on October 14, 1774. It outlined colonial objections to the Intolerable Acts. It listed a colonial Bill of Rights earlier than Virginia and provided a detailed list of grievances. It was passed similar to the Declaration of Rights and Grievances passed by the Stamp Act Congress a decade earlier. Obviously, there was some great success in resisting and nullifying the Stamp Act. So they were basically replicating that. Now, there had been almost a decade since there was a lot of calm for a while, but the king, the unlimited power, the sovereign, they never, ever stop. They may slow things down from time to time, but they're always trying to expand their power. That is the nature of government power. So even though things kind of chilled out for a bit, they certainly, over time, eventually ramped up again. And this is what we ended up with. Going back to this, they say the declaration concluded with an outline of Congress's plans. And this is where they said, hey, we're going to do this, this, this. And I'll get to it in a little bit more detail in a moment. To enter into a boycott of British trade. The Continental Association is what it was called. Until their grievances were redressed. To publish addresses to the people of Great Britain and British America, and to send a petition to the king. Now to the text of it. And this is from the Liberty Fund, which I use in links in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty all the time, because they're a great resource on free and easy to find original source documents. And here, the first line, literally the first line, is a common phrase throughout the days leading up to the revolution and even after it started. Whereas, since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statute in all cases whatsoever. All cases whatsoever. If you listen to the show on a regular basis, and I did this right around Independence Day this year as well, I talked about that phrase, all cases whatsoever. It was a constant refrain. They were concerned about unlimited, arbitrary, tyrannical power. If a government can do whatever it wants in any situation, whenever it wants, you live under a tyranny. That is what they called arbitrary government. They used this term, again, John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson used this term the following year, in July of 1775, in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. So when they're saying, look, we are fighting, there is violence now, even though we're not separating from the empire at this point, we are certainly defending ourselves. And the reason is, one of the main reasons is, look, you claim this power to bind us in all cases whatsoever. This resonated with the people of the time. They said, by one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And again, Thomas Paine in December of 1776 in the American crisis, when things were really, it was a difficult go that first winter there, or in December of that year. And he was like, look, you can't give up now, because if you do, they are claiming the power to bind us in all cases whatsoever. So even if they kind of back down now, in a few years, they've got that on the books. And with that there is no turning back. So that's an important foundation and where this starts. I covered that in a little bit more detail. July 3rd of this year, free and independent states going beyond the Declaration. I will link to that episode so you can check it out in case you haven't already. That will be in the show notes as well. So then they went through kind of an overview of those 4 intolerable acts, and they started listing, they said, like, based on this, like, look, here are our rights. These are immutable. You can't touch it. This is what we're making a stand on. And I'm just going to go through some of the highlights, not all 10. Mind you, there are 10. So we think of the Bill of Rights today. There were 12 proposed. They ended up with 10. There were also 10 listed in this as well. The first one, that they are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they have never ceded to any sovereign power whatever a right to dispose of either without their consent. And whether it's John Jay or John Dickinson or anyone in between, we heard James Otis, Samuel Adams, we heard over and over and over in the 1760s and 1770s, what liberty is there? And again, I'm paraphrasing, but we heard the same type of phrase. What liberty is there if government can take your property without your consent? There is no liberty, because you have that property rights foundation. And if government claims the power over it to just take it away at will, then you don't actually have property. You don't have any ownership. Government does. So that was number 1. The first thing that they listed, life, liberty, and property. And it had to be consent to give that up. Number 4, the foundation of English liberty. Mind you, they all considered themselves loyal subjects. Maybe John Adams was one of the few that was kind of stepping out from there. Samuel Adams probably thought that war was inevitable at that point, but I think he was even still holding out. John Adams was most forceful, at least from my understanding. They said the foundation of English liberty and of all free government is a right in the people to participate in their legislative council. And as the English colonists are not represented, and from their local and other circumstances cannot be properly represented in the British Parliament. I got to have a quick aside. I just recently did an episode on Brutus Paper Number 1, which was published in October of 1787. Maybe I'll highlight that again when we get to the actual date. Sorry about that, guys. My phone is going off. All right. It was published in October of 1787. And in Brutus Number 1, he talked about the dangers of centralization of power. And one of the things that ended up from that, what he talked about, was the impossibility in a large government to have proper representation. Because either what you're going to have, if you have one representative supposedly representing a bunch of people, it's impossible to represent their interests. Or if you have so many representatives that you can properly represent their interests, then you have the problem where it's basically a democracy, which has its own issues. So they're talking about the issue of having good, realistic, proper representation. And maybe that in and of itself is an oxymoron. Maybe it's impossible, but this is what they were going for. They said they are entitled to a free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures. This really is the structure of the Constitution as well. This was the foundation of it. Thomas Jefferson referred to the foundation of the Constitution as the principle that became the 10th Amendment, that they only have powers to do what has been delegated to them, and the people in each area, the people of the several states, or in this situation in 1774 in each of the colonies, they had exclusive right to basically legislate for themselves in their own area and deal with their bad politicians in their own area. This wasn't a centralized system that they were supporting. So they were entitled to a free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures, where their right of representation can alone be preserved. In all cases of taxation and internal polity, we call it the police power these days. All police power is on the state level. The federal government does not have authority to prosecute and deal with internal polity. Subject only to the negative of their sovereign in such manner as has been heretofore used and accustomed. So that's number 1 and number 4. Filthy Capitalist over in the chat says, please silence your phones for the duration of today's feature film. I usually do it. Thanks for calling that out. That's pretty funny. Number 8, I think, is really interesting. It sounds a lot like the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights today. Number 8, they say they have a right peaceably to assemble, consider of their grievances, and petition the king, and that all prosecutions, prohibitory proclamations, and commitments for the same are illegal. This also is a precursor to nullification, state-level nullification at least. It's basically saying, look, the colonies are making the determination that your far-off action is illegal. We're not saying we think it's illegal, and then hopefully you'll agree with us that's illegal, and then we will only act on it being illegal when your own government tells us that's illegal. That's basically the system, the activism approach of most people today. They may think something's illegal, but they only actually consider it illegal when the federal government tells us that the federal government committed an illegal act through the federal courts, and which is the idea of this is absolutely absurd. It runs totally counter to the approach of the founders and the old revolutionaries. They said, look, this is how it is. Now, what's going to happen? We've got a standoff. Then they went on to this one, and this was a recurring theme. And I also wanted to point out that a lot of these, whether it was the First Amendment, Second Amendment, 10th Amendment, any of them in between, when we hear about the Bill of Rights, a lot of people will tell you like, oh, they created the right, or you have a constitutional right because it's there. But those were actually just declarations of what were considered pre-existing rights. They never proposed new rights. They were stating and reaffirming rights that they felt that they had had all along. So the next one is standing armies. Number 9, they keep that the keeping of a standing army in these colonies in times of peace without the consent of the legislature of that colony in which such army is kept is against the law. They aren't saying we're suing you. There is no lawsuit. They're just saying it is against the law, and then here's what we're going to do about it. That's coming in just a moment. And then number 10, and this really gets down to the separation of powers. It is indispensably necessary to good government and rendered essential by the English Constitution, mind you, the English Constitution was the unwritten Constitution, that the constituent branches of the legislature be independent of each other. Separation of powers. We often attribute that type of thing to John Adams in North Carolina with his paper for North Carolina. But it really was an understood process already. He was just reaffirming, maybe putting in better words, what was already understood. The constraint of branches, the constituent branches of the legislature be independent of each other, that therefore the exercise of legislative power in several colonies by a council appointed during pleasure by the crown is unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive to the freedom of American legislation. So the notion that the executive branch today can basically, through executive order, come up with things that are binding on the people of the several states without approval of that state legislature is also unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive to freedom. The idea that Congress can delegate power that's been delegated to it to some unconstitutional agency, ATF, DEA, whatever, and then they can come up with rules on how they want to apply things. And then over time, they can change those rules. They can change definitions. They can call an accessory to a firearm, for example, a machine gun. And suddenly now that accessory counts as a machine gun that's going to be banned. I'm talking to you, bump stock people. But anyways, this is also unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive to freedom. We're talking about a separation of powers, delegated powers only being authorized in a certain sphere, and everything else is reserved to the people of the colonies at the time, the people of the several states today. These are all foundational principles that didn't just come up out of thin air at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. They were just trying to come up with a better form of putting these principles together than they had had at the time. And whether they did or not, the point is, this had been around for a long time. And even though this was already published in 1774, these were also reaffirming widely held principles that were understood already for a number of years as well. So standing armies, we heard about, I wanted to point out, we've heard this opposition to standing armies from across the political spectrum, if you can really say one at the time, whether it's George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, Samuel Adams, James Madison, Joseph Warren, Thomas Paine, so many others repeated this concern about keeping a standing army. They all recognized that standing armies, now they didn't all oppose them completely, but they all recognized that standing armies were dangerous to liberty because they lived through this kind of garbage. And we should learn from their experience so we don't have to go through the same kind of tyranny, but unfortunately it's probably far more aggressive than they had back then. So then they went through listing all the acts. I mean, they literally, after the set of rights, and I'm going to scroll through here, they said, in the course of our inquiry, we find many infringements and violations of the foregoing rights. So we've got these 10 listed rights. This is our Declaration of Rights. It's really a precursor, I think, to much of the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights. We find many infringements, which, from an ardent desire that harmony and mutual intercourse of affection and interest may be restored, we pass over for the present and proceed to state such acts and measures as have been adopted since the last war, which demonstrate a system formed to enslave America. Like, look, these are the rights, and now here are a list of the things that you've passed that have attacked these unalienable, immutable rights that we will not give up. These are intolerable actions on your part. And they go through all the different sections in very detail, several acts of 4, 12, on and on and on. There's a long list. Again, I will link to the full text of this in the show notes so you can read it if you'd like. And they say, to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. In response to the Stamp Act, just before it went into effect, John Hancock sent a letter to his London agent, and he says, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. And that's the mentality that was had. If you attacked these rights, it wasn't, well, give me a permission slip to exercise my right. It was, we will not, we cannot submit. Unfortunately, we have a long-standing tradition and history in our modern times, in our own existence, of submission first and looking for permission later on from the people who are passing the legislation, the people who are enforcing the acts that violate our rights. And we can cover almost the entire Bill of Rights, almost all of the Constitution. We see it all being violated all the time, every single day. And yet, there's more submission than resistance. To these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. And that's what Patrick Henry talked about in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in the summer of 1788. He said, when the spirit of America was in its youth, liberty was its primary object. Going forward, they say, we hope to have, happiness and prosperity, so we have for the present only resolved to pursue the following peaceable measures. This is a warning. Like, look, at this time, these are the 3 steps we're going to take. And if it doesn't work, something else is obviously going to happen. And we know that the following year, just months later, I guess, July of 1775. So this is October. So my government school math is pretty bad. That's what, like 8 months later? Less than a year later, they followed up with the declarations of causes as to why they were taking up arms that was drafted by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. So we have only resolved to pursue the following peaceable measures. And you've heard me oftentimes talk about local so-called Second Amendment sanctuaries, where I complain that they're only passing resolutions. The reason that I primarily complain that they're passing resolutions is because they're not being presented as a statement of principles and a statement of goals and a statement of here's what's coming next. They're being passed as sanctuaries, which to most people give the impression of a safe space. But that's not what they're doing. They didn't call it this. They passed a resolution here in 1774 that said, here's what we're standing on, here's the principles we believe in, and here's what we're going to do next. And here's a warning for what comes after that. And that is really the structure that makes for a very good non-binding resolution. So here are the 3 peaceable measures. 1, to enter into a non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement or association. They passed a formal document putting that into practice the following week. 2, to prepare an address to the people of Great Britain and a memorial to the inhabitants of British America. And 3, to prepare a loyal address to His Majesty, agreeable to resolutions already entered into. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. For me, I learn a lot when I go through these year in and year out. There's always something new, and it's a reminder as I talk about these things, how many of the principles that we are focused on, the system of federalism, decentralization, the 10th Amendment, resistance, nullification, really just didn't come out of nowhere. When I've often talked about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison first formalizing the principles of nullification in the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, and I used to not do this because I really didn't know. I had to learn over time. They weren't actually creating the doctrine out of thin air. They were just reaffirming this type of principle that they had lived through, that everyone understood was the proper response to unconstitutional power, whether it was the Stamp Act, whether it was the Townsend Acts, or whether it was the Intolerable Acts. So I hope you guys learned something from this. To me, it's so incredibly interesting. I'm going to take a quick look over in the live chat. DL Neal, thanks for saying, I always learn something new to read about when I watch your show. Thank you. Funky Euphemism says, Liberty Fund is the single most helpful source for politics and law. It probably is, at least for this show. Repeatedly, this is the #1 website, libertyfund.org, where I'm finding these original source documents. If you want to find the debates and the several state conventions, you can find the 5-volume set, Eliot's debates, you can find this document, so much more. There's tons of awesome stuff. Clay Kent says, yet here we are with the theft of property taxes. Yeah, without a doubt. So do you really own your property if they can actually collect taxes from it and then take it from you? That is certainly an argument to be made. Clay Kent also says, live free or die. I will scroll through this and take a look through the comments a little bit later on. I read through all of them. I don't get a chance to reply to all of them, but I do my best every single time. Of course, if you support the show, you like what we're doing, you enjoyed this information, there's a number of free things that you can do to help us spread the word. The algorithms of all the mainstream platforms you watch or listen on are very easily triggered. So a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Podbean or wherever, that helps tell the platform to show the program to more people, or comments, likes, shares, notifications on YouTube, Facebook, and elsewhere, that all does the same thing. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, Do not feel obligated to do so, but if you can spare as little as $2 a month, please consider joining us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And for the many of you out there who I've already seen who are currently doing that on a monthly or an annual basis, thank you so much for your support. There's no way we could get the job done without your help. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.